Living a healthy life doesn't have to be complicated. Through conversations on nutrition, holistic wellness, non-toxic living, and faith, this podcast is here to encourage, equip, and inspire you to care for your body well. I'm Kelly, and you're listening to the Bloom Your Health podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Bloom Your Health podcast. Today, I am joined by Jonathan Jarecki, an undergraduate student at Davidson College studying biology and neuroscience. Jonathan is also the host of the Signal podcast and has created an Instagram account where he explores different types of light and how it impacts our bodies. Today, we're going to dive into the importance of sunlight and how our increasingly indoor lifestyles may be affecting our health. We will also talk about how we can be exposed to natural light and make simple changes to better support our everyday wellness. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kelly. I'm excited for the conversation.
So can you explain to me how you grew up and how that's shaped your view on health today?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I was super blessed to be raised in a family that was very holistic minded. So growing up, I'm a child of four children that my mom had. I'm the youngest, and so three older siblings. And growing up, we were raised with this mindset that the body has the innate capacity to heal, and you need to give it the right signals and the right conditions to actually do that healing. And so growing up, I never really went to the doctor growing up. I mean, I went to the doctor like 18 times, and that was just for the yearly checkup that my school required. But outside of that, never went to the doctor, was fairly, very pretty like healthy child, never took any medications, never took any pharmaceutical drug in my entire life, which again, super blessed. And I think, just with this idea that if you have the right lifestyle, have the right nutrition, if you have all these things set in place for your children, this was my mom's belief, that, you don't need to rely on the doctors and you can put your health in your own hands. And I think a lot of it, my mom got educated on this stuff very early on. I mean, I tell everyone like my infrared sauna is older than myself. It's like 30 something years old. So we've been on this since day one, before like biohacking was a term or anything like that. And so that was sort of that environment that was surrounded by. So never really, had always understood this idea that, chronic disease is absolutely preventable, and any disease in that fact is absolutely preventable, and also reversible, right? So I think that's another big thing, like especially with the standard medical establishment. It's like, all right, well, if you have this disease, we can sort of, help mitigate any symptoms and things like that. But, their focus is never really on reversal. In some cases it may be, but for a big part, it's like, all right, how can we just sort of put a Band-Aid on these things? But I think, it's a big thing. It's like, it's reversible, but also absolutely preventable if we have the right lifestyle. So yeah, super blessed to have been raised in that environment and to have that knowledge. And then around, like 4-ish years ago is when I started diving deeper into the science myself, because before that it was everything, whatever my mom told me is sort of what I took for granted, and, it worked. But, wanted to have sort of a backing on why I had these beliefs, and some of these beliefs are super, super strong. And so if I had these strong beliefs, I wanted to know why I had them in the first place. So, I started reading books, listening to podcasts, was diving deep into the actual primary literature on many different topics, and just fell in love with the science. And like you said, been posting stuff on social media now, communicating that science with the general public, because I believe that if we can share, science with the general public, I think that's probably the biggest thing that can actually help people's lives, because again, a lot of the stuff is just not known. It's not taught about in the medical establishment. Even some doctors may not even know that, you can prevent, their patients' diseases with lifestyle interventions. So I think, just sharing that information out there, and the more we can do that, I think the better. So like I always say, like the more voices we have sharing this stuff, the better. So I love what you're doing with your Instagram and the podcast and everything. And we need more people sharing it. So I love it. But yeah, that's a little bit about like my upbringing.
Yeah, oh my goodness, I love that. Yeah, and I obviously love everything you're doing too. You're so informative. Every time I look at your Instagram account and you've got your whiteboard behind you and you're explaining everything, I'm like, oh my gosh, he is so smart and he just knows so much about this topic. And like you said too about how people just don't know. I mean, my mom always says you do the best with the knowledge you have at the time.
Yeah.
And obviously maybe we have more knowledge now than we did even just a year ago, 2 years
Mhm.
ago. And now even just recently with this new UC Davis study that came out with all the
Mhm. Yeah.
avocado oil and
Yeah.
oh my goodness, like just the amount of stuff that we were buying that had 100% pure avocado oil, and now it's just completely false. And again, we learn new things every day, and our views are constantly changing because we're learning
Hmm.
so much. But
Yeah.
yeah, and kind of a little bit going off of what you said, but how did you specifically become so interested in sunlight and the light and how that affects our bodies?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So, growing up, my mom always raised us, with like going out into nature and being out in the sunshine. She never put sunscreen on us, so I never had a fear of the sun or anything like that. And I had sort of a pretty good, relationship with the sun, but it was definitely not like a priority. So our big pillars were mainly nutrition. We did a lot of like detoxification protocols, like fasting and infrared saunas and Epsom salt baths and all those sorts of things. But sunlight was not like a big priority, or like circadian biology was not. But so yeah, when I was started getting into just learning about the science behind all of our health practices growing up, that's what led me down the light rabbit hole. And I listened to a podcast. A lot of people in like the circadian biology space are familiar with this podcast, but it was a podcast with Jack Cruz, Andrew Huberman, and Rick Rubin, 7-hour podcast. And I listened to that, and I was absolutely blown away. I was big fan of Huberman, and he's a big inspiration with just everything he's done with his podcast and online platform. And then Jack Cruz, I wasn't familiar with, but after listening to that, I quickly became familiar with his work. And yeah, he's basically this neurosurgeon who has, I would say, sort of pioneered the space behind how light affects the human body, and utilizing research from a bunch of different fields to sort of come to this sort of nice cohesive conclusion about it. But yeah, so I listened to that podcast, was super intrigued, started diving deep into the literature, and started like asking, like questioning some of the stuff that was talked about in that podcast. And then I found out a lot of it to be true. And then I just fell in love with the light message, because I think it's one that's not talked about a whole ton, especially in the health and wellness space. It's like, all right, diet and nutrition. Once you have those two things, like, you're golden, right? But I think there's so many other pillars to health. One of those other pillars is light and our light environment. So both natural daylight, but also artificial light, and how that affects the human body. And so I think it's the science can get complex, but the message really is super, super simple. And it's getting back out into nature and being outside as much as possible. And that's sort of a nice, simple message. And, there's obviously nuance to all of it, but I think that's what I really just found fascinating. And I think it also is such an important aspect to our health. I mean, circadian biology in and of itself, our circadian system governs every single organ, every single cell in our body. So obviously it's going to have so many downstream effects. And, our circadian system is primarily governed by light, but also, the interaction with light on our skin and our mitochondria and all that. And we'll talk all about that stuff. But it was just such a fascinating sort of information that I was learning, and just started sharing that. And I think once you get into the light sort of rabbit hole, there's no going back, especially once you implement these things into your life. There's no going back. And that's what I've experienced. And I think that's what a lot of people have also experienced.
Yeah, I think that goes for a lot of things too. It's like once you just dive down the rabbit hole, it's like,
Yeah.
oh gosh, you can't bring yourself back out. And I
Yeah.
know specifically my mom kind of went down the rabbit hole with vaccines and
Mhm.
all that crazy stuff, which I'm sure we can dive into in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think the sunlight thing, like you said, is so interesting that people kind of just forget that, we just focus so much on diet and lifestyle, which of course is very, very important. But
Mhm.
we forget about this huge thing, sunlight, that
Yeah.
God gave us for a reason. And
Yeah.
even myself included, I need to do a better job of getting out in the sun. And I think it's especially more difficult in places where winter is 6 months out of the year.
Yeah. For
But
sure.
again, trying to do a better job and
Mhm.
hopefully, yeah. But I guess also, can you explain maybe in simple terms to someone that might not understand what the difference between red light and blue light is, and just the difference between how we're getting our light from the sunlight and all those
Mhm.
kinds of things? Just to maybe explain that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's probably the two wavelengths that people are most familiar with, especially like in the
Hmm.
health world. Blue light at night, blue light from your phones, all that, and then the red light therapy devices. So those are the big sort of main wavelengths. But I think it's good to start with, like, all right, sunlight, right? So the wavelengths from sunlight. So sunlight is full spectrum, meaning it goes from the UV, which is an invisible wavelength of light, to the visible. So the visible is all the colors of the rainbow. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, violet, and indigo. And then past red, just beyond red, is infrared. So another invisible light wavelength to the human eye. So the human eye cannot see infrared. Other animals actually can see infrared, but humans cannot. And so that's sort of that sunlight spectrum. When we can take specific wavelengths of this, and this is what we've done in the literature, is take specific wavelengths, see what outcomes it has on organisms or humans or cells or whatever that may be. And so thinking about just putting this into perspective of like, all right, how do we understand these wavelengths? So, UV, I think most people know, like, all right, I'm getting out into sunlight because I want to have increase my vitamin D levels, and you're increasing your vitamin D because of the UV light from the sun. And again, that's an invisible light wavelength. And then even UV can be split up into UVA and UVB. UVB is what produces vitamin D within the body, and then UVA has other health benefits like nitric oxide mobilization and cardiovascular effects as well. Going into the visible spectrum, so yeah, that's when we have blue, right? So just beyond UV, violet, and then blue. And so blue light is abundant in the sun. So when we go out into sunlight, we are getting tons in blue light. And so we can talk about like the nuance behind, well, why is blue light from the sun beneficial, but blue light from artificial sources is not. And there's a big distinction between those. But that's, blue light can help set your circadian system. So the primary zeitgeber or timekeeper of the circadian clock, which is this internal clock within the brain. It's a suprachiasmatic nucleus within the hypothalamus of the brain. And this clock is essentially, it is a clock, and it tells the time to the rest of your body. I think about it as like the Big Ben of your body. So, you're in London, you see the Big Ben, you can see it from all around London, and it tells you the time. And so that's basically what our clock is. It's this big clock that tells all your cells. Your cells can look at it basically and see what time of day it is. And that clock is governed by the light, mainly governed by the light that gets into our eyes. And the primary wavelength that sort of sets that clock is blue light. So around 480 nanometers, which is that circadian stimulating blue, which again, abundant in sunlight, that sets that circadian system. So, the two like hormones people think about when we talk about the circadian system is melatonin and cortisol. So in the morning, when we're exposed to that blue light, it spikes our cortisol, which is actually a good thing. We have what's called a cortisol awakening response curve, which in the morning, again, cortisol has its own circadian rhythm. So in the morning, it's super high, and then at night, it should be super low. And then when we're exposed to that blue light in the morning, also melatonin is going to drop off. We don't want melatonin in the morning. We do want melatonin at night. So when we have a lack of blue light at night, that's when melatonin is going to increase, and that's when cortisol is going to come low. And then whenever we disrupt those light signals, so if we have artificial light from our phones, that's going to disrupt those cortisol and melatonin responses. So that's sort of the blue light sector. And then even outside of circadian, like blue light is also affecting our mitochondria, which we can talk about more. And isolated blue light it's a problem because of that, but also from a hormonal perspective. So it really encompasses the whole body and physiology. And then going down the light wavelengths, we have red, right? So red is a longer wavelength of light, so it can actually penetrate deeper into the body. And this light wavelength is also again abundant in sunlight. It is not very abundant in our artificially lit indoor environments. And then just beyond red, which is probably the most important wavelength, is even saying like most important, they're all super important, and bringing them all together is what is the most important thing. And that's, when we go outside into sun. But the longer wavelengths of infrared, so these are super long wavelengths of light. They penetrate completely through the human body, and they are interacting with pretty much every single cell within the human body. And these light wavelengths primarily affect our mitochondria. So they get absorbed by our mitochondria, increasing our mitochondrial health. And so that's sort of the full spectrum of sunlight and what we're getting when we're being exposed outdoors. And then we can sort of affect that spectrum via a bunch of different things. Windows affect the spectrum. Of course, going into artificially lit indoor environment, the spectrum is much different. So like an LED has a big spike in just blue light, and very little red, zero infrared. So it distorts the natural spectrum that our body is adapted to and our body expects. So I sort of think about it as, our body constantly 24/7 expects the full spectrum of light all the time, right? And whenever we disconnect from what our body expects naturally, well, then there is going to be consequences down the road. And what's great is, we have now amazing scientific literature backing all this stuff up. So we love, we'll talk more about it, but that's a little bit about that full spectrum of light.
Yeah, and I know that you touched a little bit about blue light and isolated blue light and how that's not great. But what is it specifically about like an LED light that is disrupting your nervous system and the biological clock in your body?
Yeah, great question. So again, right, blue light in isolation is the big problem. So when we're exposed to sunlight, like I said, there's tons of blue light, but what matters there is it's balanced by the infrared. So whenever we are exposed to natural light, there is blue, but it's always also balanced by infrared light. And so that's a key component here. Now, when we look at the LED light bulb spectrum, right? What it is, it's RGB, red, green, blue. So there's a spike in the blue, there's a small spike in the green, and small spike in the red. And so that isolated part of that blue light is what's concerning. So, I think the main thing to talk about here is like the mitochondrial health. So blue light doesn't absorb too deep in the body, so it will get to our skin cells and pretty much all of our skin cells. But there's a big effect. So all of our cells contain mitochondria. And these mitochondria are these little organelles within all of our cells that are basically the powerhouse of the cell, right? They give us energy, and they transform energy. So the food that we eat, they transform the energy in that food to energy that our body can actually utilize day to day. And so when blue light from LEDs and from screens and from phones and all these things, when it gets absorbed by our skin and then in our mitochondria, what happens is it creates what's called reactive oxygen species. So these are these free radicals that basically create this oxidative environment, and it can also be a very damaging environment. So reactive oxygen species in them of itself are not a bad thing. Now, if we have too many reactive oxygen species, that's when sort of that balance goes out of whack, and then we have downstream consequences. Too much reactive oxygen species can cause DNA damage. It can cause a bunch of other different things. People take antioxidants because of this very reason, right? We want to offset those reactive oxygen species. These antioxidants are antioxidants, so they'll basically scavenge those free radicals, those reactive oxygen species. And so that blue light in isolation is creating this environment within the mitochondria of this oxidative environment, which can have which basically just damage our mitochondria. And foundationally, if we look at any single chronic disease, at the foundation of pretty much every single chronic disease, there's mitochondrial dysfunction. So if we can keep mitochondria healthy, that is when we can prevent chronic disease if we have healthy mitochondria. So and our mitochondria are these light sensitive organelles. We can think about it from like an evolutionary standpoint. I don't agree with evolution, but I think it's an interesting framework to go off of. From an evolutionary standpoint, what you learn in any single biology classroom is there's this endosymbiotic theory where basically there's these two bacteria, and one bacteria engulfed the other bacteria, and that is how we have mitochondria today. And there's some evidence behind this, right? It's like the mitochondria today have a double membrane. So thinking, all right, well, there was one bacteria that had one membrane, another bacteria that had another membrane engulfing. Now you have double membrane. Mitochondrial DNA also look like bacterial DNA and all these other things. But this is to say from this evolutionary framework, the descendants of the bacteria that soon then became mitochondria were photosynthetic. So they actually used light to generate energy. And so it just makes sense if you're thinking about it from that point of view. Well, then our mitochondria are also going to use light to affect its energy transformative effects. So that's sort of the effect of blue light. And when we're outdoors in sunlight, because I think this is key, right? That balancing effect that I talked about with the infrared. When we're outdoors in sunlight, yeah, our mitochondria are being exposed to that blue light, but it's also being exposed to tons of red and infrared. And that red and infrared, one of the things it does is it actually produces a ton of antioxidants. So one of the strongest antioxidants that our body produces itself is melatonin. So a lot of people think of melatonin as a sleep-inducing molecule, which it definitely is. So at night, our pineal gland in our brain, in the absence of light, produces melatonin, bathes our brain at night. It's a sleep-inducing molecule. But melatonin also is a very strong antioxidant. And what some of the research is coming to understand within the past 10-ish years, again, not in the textbooks because science takes a whole long time to get to its understanding of things. But within the past 10 years, what the research is pointing to is that our mitochondria actually produce melatonin within the mitochondria throughout the day, irrespective of nighttime melatonin. So this is same melatonin molecule, but our body's actually also producing melatonin throughout the day. And this is not sleep inducing. So this is separate from those sleep inducing properties of melatonin at night in the brain. And this is on site in the mitochondria. And the reason for this is because naturally, when our mitochondria are working, they are producing reactive oxygen species. Now, when they're working, plus working in an indoor environment with tons of blue light, they're producing even more reactive oxygen species. And so our mitochondria do have processes to produce melatonin within it to then combat those reactive oxygen species. And melatonin, like I said, the strongest antioxidant. So many people think of like glutathione or vitamin C as really strong antioxidants, which they are. But for every one glutathione antioxidant, it can scavenge up to one free radical. For every one melatonin molecule, it can scavenge up to 10 reactive oxygen species. So melatonin is a much stronger and more potent antioxidant. So this is why it's produced on site in the mitochondria where most of the reactive oxygen species is being produced. So it can scavenge those reactive oxygen species. Now, when we're outdoors in sunlight, long wavelengths red and infrared light can actually help our mitochondria produce more subcellular, more melatonin within the mitochondria to offset any of those reactive oxygen species that are being produced from the blue light we're being exposed to outdoors. Now, when we move indoors, we don't have that stimulus of the red and infrared light to produce more melatonin within the mitochondria. That's when we're going to have that off balance effect of now we're producing more reactive oxygen species, less melatonin. That combating effect of the melatonin is not going to occur on the reactive oxygen species, and then that's where the sort of reactive environment comes from when we're being exposed to those LEDs with tons of blue light. So that's just like one main component of it, and then there's another component of the circadian stimulus where, and we know this, like architects and building engineers and companies, they'll intentionally use very bright blue light in their work environments because we know that brighter blue light throughout the day makes us more of in this sort of it increases productivity because it puts us in this more alert state of mind. So now, and this is the reason for this is because it's affecting our hormones. So our eyes are sort of that key window into how our hormones fluctuate. And our eyes, when it receives light signals, it's going to affect how our hormones fluctuate. And so when we're exposed to tons of blue light that's stimulating the circadian system 24/7, right? What happens is it produces cortisol. And cortisol many people think of cortisol as a stress hormone, which it totally is. But really it's what's called a glucocorticoid. So meaning cortisol, the main reason our body produces cortisol is it transports glucose within the body. So if you think about it, from a primordial stance, like, our ancestors would have needed, whenever, it was exposed to a stressor, let's say it's being chased by some animal or whatever, right? It needs a lot of glucose to support the muscles, whatever the movement, if it's running away, and those muscles that are doing a lot of work for the body to run needs glucose. So cortisol is going to spike in response to that stressor, transport glucose within the body, bring the glucose to the muscles, and that's the main role of cortisol. Now, in our modern environment, we are having high cortisol because we're exposed to tons of blue light, but we're also sedentary. So we're also not moving. So now we're having more glucose being shuttled to our muscles when our muscles don't actually need it. And this is really where we see the rise in pre-diabetes and also type 2 diabetes. And so that is one of the players, right? Obviously diet has a huge component there as well. But the light stimulus that our eyes are getting entrained to are also affecting how our body's utilizing the glucose that is being produced. So that's sort of a little bit about how this isolated blue light can be detrimental.
Yeah, well, I even think talking about the blue light and our sedentary lifestyles, just even schools now, even at my school, just these artificial blue light, just constant in your face, in your eyes. And I think that's definitely contributing to a lot of things too. I think schools need to start getting back into putting natural light sources, more natural
Mm-hmm.
light. And even something that was so disappointing at my high school is every single room had like one window that was not the biggest window. It felt
Mm-hmm.
like there was zero natural light. It was like we were in a dungeon all day. And
Yeah.
I'm just like, this is so crazy that it should be mandatory that there has to be more windows,
Yeah.
less or more natural light, less artificial light. And I think that's
Yeah, and
crazy.
we can
And
we can even one point on that, like when we look at we have tons and tons of studies looking at um hospitalization, so people that are in hospitals and their outcomes when they are in a room near a window versus in a room with no windows. And what we see time and time again, every single study shows us that the patients who are near a window and also windows that face east, so that's getting just more bright morning sunlight into the window, they have better health outcomes and better. They leave the hospital sooner, so their length of stay is reduced. And we know also by adding in near infrared light to these people who are in the hospital. There was a study out of Brazil where they used what's called, they basically made an infrared light jacket. So it had a bunch of infrared LEDs, or LEDs that just emitted infrared light. An LED isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. Standard LEDs is the problem. So you can create an LED that just produces infrared light, and that's totally fine. But they had this infrared light jacket. They put it on these people in the hospital in critical care units. So these are the most unhealthy individuals, and they had a 30% reduction in length of stay just by wearing the LED light jacket. So clearly, we want both. We want that infrared back into the environment, and hospitals are actually waking up to this. There was within this year, 2026, there's been, I think, either 2 or 3 hospitals. I definitely know of 2. I think there was a third one as well, that have been understanding this concept that, all right, yeah, our patients' light environment is totally out of whack and not benefiting them at all. And so there was a hospital recently that just created a garden at the top of their hospital where the critical care unit is, and they're actually bringing patients in the critical care unit out on this garden, getting direct sunlight, which is amazing, and they're seeing great effects. And even where this really started from, this goes back for hundreds of years, but more recently, Dr. Roger Schwelt, he's a quadruple board certified physician out of Loma Linda, California. He is a critical care specialist, so he's in the critical care units, again, working with the sickest of the sickest patients. And during COVID, he was in there during COVID, and what he was seeing is that these patients who had the highest vitamin D levels had the best outcomes, and this was looked at observationally in tons of studies. However, when they started giving vitamin D supplementation, they weren't seeing the same effect. So his idea was, all right, maybe the vitamin D status is not the direct cause of why these people were having better health outcomes. Maybe the vitamin D was just a proxy for how much sun exposure these people were getting. And the people who had the most sun exposure had the best outcomes. So what he started doing is he started bringing his patients with COVID outside in direct sunlight for just like 15 minutes every single day. And he tells a story of this one patient who was on 100% oxygen levels, and where he was basically about to die. Basically, his last wish was actually, I want to go outside. And they were like, all right, the guy's about to die. Let's try to make his wish happen. They hooked up the oxygen tank to his thing, brought him outside. Next day, he needed less oxygen, so it went down to 85%. Then next day, brought outside again, 75. Kept going down and down and down until he got complete discharge from the hospital. Complete remission from COVID, which was the doctors were like, what the heck? So Roger Schultz saw this, started to bring his patients outdoors. He's been an amazing advocate for this, especially with hospitals. And now we're seeing more and more hospitals understanding this and trying to implement better practices for their patients. And it's working. And even, I'll just touch on this real quick. When we look at this, none of this is also new, right? So hospitals so before the Flexner report, which was this report that went around that basically, before this report, I'll touch on the report in a little bit, but before this report, hospitals all around the United States were very holistically minded. So pretty much every single hospital had what's called sun beds. So they basically had beds for their patients where they brought them outdoors into direct sunlight. And this was one of the major practices that were going on in hospitals. And there's, great physicians, Auguste Rollier, Niels Finzen. Niels Finzen actually won a Nobel Prize for light therapy for tuberculosis. So he was curing tuberculosis just with light. And then Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg, who, yes, that's why we have Kellogg's Frosted Flakes. So he was a little crazy guy, but there are some great things that he actually did. And one of the great things is that he ran the largest sanitarium, which were basically hospitals back in the day, where all the presidents and all the major people were going to this hospital. And he was using direct sunlight to cure tuberculosis, to cure a bunch of other ailments. And so this was a standard practice in all hospitals around the United States back in the day. So none of this is new, and they were seeing amazing things. Now with the Flexner report, so Rockefeller at this time was basically. And this can go into a bunch of conspiracy theories, but I'll just tell you what the actual history is. And what the history is that Rockefeller at the time was seeing that, he can produce with he was big into oil, so he was able to see that he can actually produce pharmaceutical drugs with crude oil. So he was using crude oil to produce these pharmaceutical drugs. But the problem was at the time, a lot of medicine was very holistically minded. So there wasn't this idea of let's produce pharmaceutical drugs. This is sort of when it started coming around. And so in order to get these hospitals to start buying the pharmaceutical drugs off of him, what he did was he had this guy named Flexner, who was not in the medical world at all. I think he would like study like sociology or something. I don't even know. But he went around all these hospitals, basically came out with this report on how all these hospitals were like, they were just like cracks, and they were completely like woo woo, and it was not working. And after that report, that's when hospitals started making a turn to starting to use pharmaceutical drugs and all that. And that's when sunbeds left hospitals. And so now, we have these patients in this dark room, a lot of the times no windows. If they're lucky enough, they can be by a window, and then we see better health outcomes. But there was this idea that yes, the sun actually had healing capabilities, and we've lost that. But I think now we're coming back to this understanding with more research coming out, that yes, the sun is actually very healing, especially for the sickest of the people. The people who are the most sick need it the most. So that's my little tangent about why we need sunlight back into the hospitals. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I also think not only are we doing a disservice to the patients that need the sunlight, we're also doing a disservice to the doctors who are in this environment every single day and they need sunlight just as much as everyone else does. So I think that that's,
100%. Yeah.
yeah. And kind of touching a little bit on how you were talking about vitamin D, what is the difference between supplementing vitamin D, which obviously still has benefits, I think, but
Mhm.
maybe you can tell me, and getting vitamin D from the sun?
Yeah. Yeah. This is a great question. So I'll first say that when we look at large observational studies, we do see that people who have higher vitamin D status have reductions in cardiovascular mortality, have reductions in cancer mortality, have reductions in diabetes. Have reductions in tons and tons of health diseases, right? People who have high vitamin D levels. However, the problem is when we actually look at some of the best controlled lab experiments where they are, it's a randomized placebo-controlled trial where they give one group a vitamin D pill, and then the other group, it's a placebo vitamin D pill, so no actual vitamin D. And they track these people for very long periods of time and seeing, when these people are dying. So this is like 20 plus year follow-up, seeing, all right, are these people dying, and if so, what are they dying from? And time again, these large controlled trials show that the vitamin D supplementation is not giving the same effect that we're seeing with these observational studies. So there is no, difference between the two groups, the people who are getting the vitamin D and not getting vitamin D, for cardiovascular death, cancer death, and things like that. Now, there are benefits for some other things. I mean, we know for like bone health, it can be beneficial. And obviously so rickets, right? So vitamin D, that's really when it started being advertised as like, all right, people who had rickets were low vitamin D, you give them just a vitamin D supplement, their rickets are going to go away. So we know for a fact that vitamin D in and of itself, the specific vitamin D, active form of vitamin D molecule, does have many different effects on the body and does have health benefits. So I think there is a time and place for vitamin D supplementation. But when we look again at those controlled trials, we don't see these reductions in mortality that we do with these observational studies looking at people with higher vitamin D. So I see vitamin D as simply a proxy for how much sun exposure somebody is getting. And that's really where the real benefit is going to come in. I think vitamin D you can take some supplemental vitamin D, especially like during, cold and flu season or something like that. It could be beneficial. I would suggest, higher doses of vitamin D, even like, I made a video a while back, but our current standard RDA, recommended dietary allowance of vitamin D, is completely off. And there's, after that, so that got published in 2011 when the RDA came out for vitamin D, which is 600 IUs, international units of vitamin D. That's what it's pretty much at right now. I think it maybe fluctuates depending on your age and your weight and all that, but it's like around like 600 to like 800 IUs of vitamin D per day is the recommended dose. But in 2014 and 2015, two independent mathematicians came out and they looked at the data that they used to come up with that conclusion of the 600 IUs. And their conclusion was they completely miscalculated how much people are supposed to be taking. And it was on orders of magnitude, 15 times less than what people probably should actually be taking based off of the literature. And their conclusion was around 8,000 IUs, 7 to 8,000 IUs of vitamin D per day is what the optimal dose is of what people should be getting. Now, when we go into sunlight, if UVB is present, so for instance, like northern climates during the winter, there can be months on end where UVB is not present, so you cannot produce vitamin D. But if where UVB is present, if you go outside for like 5 minutes, you'll be well past that 8,000 IUs of vitamin D, and you'll have way more. So that's clearly like sunlight is the best source to get vitamin D. Now that said, when we take a vitamin D supplement, all we're getting is either D3 or D2. Our liver then it goes into our gut, gets absorbed by our gut, goes into our bloodstream to D3 or D2, then goes to our liver. Our liver converts the D3 into 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3. And then that's the active form that our body utilizes. So that's all, but that's all you're getting. You're only getting the D3 and the D2 via oral ingestion. When we go out into sunlight and when our skin is exposed to UVB light, what happens is we have cholesterol molecules in our skin. And when it interacts with the cholesterol molecule, it basically breaks the bond. It opens that bond. It produces what's called pre-D3. The pre-D3 gets converted into D3, which is what you're getting with a supplement. And now with that D3 that your body is producing, again, within the skin, that can be converted into three different things. It can either go to our liver and get converted to the active form of vitamin D, which is what happens when you take the supplement. But there's also two other pathways, which for the past 8 years, the research has said these molecules, what I'm about to say, doesn't actually have to do anything. But researchers within the past couple years, this is very, very recent, actually have found that, these molecules that our body naturally produces actually have beneficial effects on them. So T3 and L3. So these are molecules that are also produced when we get exposed to the UVB light via that cholesterol to a pre-D3 pathway. And so within that, there are 50 other metabolites that get produced via this one pathway of going from cholesterol to vitamin D. There's 50 other metabolites that are produced within our skin locally that we obviously do not get when we just ingest the vitamin D. So I think ingesting vitamin D via supplementation can have can be beneficial in certain scenarios, but we are not getting those other 50 metabolites of vitamin D that we know, for some of them, we know have an effect. A lot of them, they just have not been studied outright. So we literally don't have any research on the other metabolites, if they have any effects on the body. But I can guarantee you they must have an effect. If our body's producing it, they're going to have an effect on our body. So I think there's this idea in science of this reductionistic viewpoint of all right, if we produce vitamin D from sunlight, so let's just supplement with vitamin D and we should be all good. But clearly that's not the case, right? And so I think they can come in tandem, and you can use them. You can utilize both sunlight and supplements equally. But I do think the body is so complex that coming in with this reductionistic mindset of all right, I'm just gonna take the vitamin D supplement and I'll be all good. It sort of undervalues the complexity of the human body. And I think if we and that's just for all our view, scientific, the scientific establishment just does that time and time again, where it's all right, we think we know more than when the body knows, where it's no, the body is much more intelligent than we can be, and more complex than we will ever understand. And so, and even that, it's there's probably so much more there that we just haven't even discovered with the UV light interacting with cholesterol molecules. So there's probably so much more that we just don't even know. So my recommendation is always sunlight's the best. In times when you're not exposed to UVB, vitamin D supplementation can be good. Also, there's companies now that use there's a company that just came out called Solius, Solius. It's a UVB light therapy panel where it gives you very very narrowband UV light. So it's isolated UV light, but they do it in a very regulated way where I've talked to some of the people there, where it's I see no detrimental effect, because I'm not a fan of isolated UV light, because in sunlight it's never isolated UV light, it's always balanced by that infrared. But what they have done is it's extremely regulated. So people who are pale skin, it may only be a minute maybe of this therapy for once a week, and they've done clinical trials where they show increases in vitamin D. And again, you're having all the increases in those other 50 metabolites of vitamin D that you're not getting from the supplementation. So I actually think UV light therapy can also have its time and place, probably even better than a supplement, a vitamin D supplement. But again, vitamin D supplements can have its time and place.
Yeah, so also touching a little bit on the UV light. So, what are the types of UV light, and which ones actually cause sunburns, and what's the concern and the benefits even of all of them?
Yeah. So when we look at UV light, we can actually split it up into three spectrums. So there's UVA, UVB, and then also UVC. So UVC, it comes from the sun, but we actually do not get it on Earth because it's absorbed in the atmosphere and it doesn't reach us. If it did reach us, that would be a big problem because it's very, very damaging to our cells. So we only get exposed to UVA and UVB. So UVB is a shorter wavelength of UV light, where UVA is a little bit longer. So that means the longer the wavelength, the deeper it can penetrate into the body. So UVB only gets to the epidermis, so the very top layer of our skin, whereas UVA can go just a little bit deeper than the epidermis. When we look at UV, it also can produce a couple other things. So it also produces this big pro-hormone called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. This is this huge pro-hormone that contains around like 250 something amino acids. So it's this big string of amino acids. And when our body produces it, it has enzymes that can cleave it or can cut this big pro-hormone into other little segments of these smaller peptides that can have a ton of different effects. So some of the peptides that it gets cleaved into are alpha MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. This is what produces a tan. So when we get exposed to UVB light, the reason we are tanning, the tanning response comes from this big pro-hormone getting cleaved into alpha MSH. And then even alpha MSH can have a lot of cardiovascular effects. So our blood vessels actually have receptors. They have alpha MSH receptors. When alpha MSH goes into our bloodstream from the UV light hitting the skin, going into the bloodstream, it can get it goes into these receptors and actually has some very good cardiovascular benefits. We actually have some beautiful rat studies where we can knock out the alpha MSH receptor, and what we see is these rats have insane increases in cardiovascular disease and thromboembolisms and all these other things, simply because the alpha MSH is not binding to the receptor because the receptor is not there. So clearly the alpha MSH itself is very beneficial from a cardiovascular standpoint. When we look at some other things that it gets cleaved into, so it gets cleaved into beta endorphin. So beta endorphin is this natural endogenous opioid that our body produces. So our body actually produces internal opioids, and one of the main ones it produces is beta endorphin. Beta endorphin is 20 times stronger than morphine. And so it's a very, very strong, actually like addictive substance. And the reason for that is because we are basically designed to be addicted to sunlight to a degree. And this is where the craze of like people going into like tanning beds and all this stuff. And like there's been like articles where it's like people are actually addicted to going to the tanning beds. And the reason for that, because they're producing a ton of beta endorphin. Now, the reason why our body does produce this in the first place is because our body knows that it needs a certain amount of sunlight. So it is going to create this response within the body to actually go seek the sun when it needs to. So it doesn't have these, detrimental aspects of not getting sunlight, rickets and all those things where it's like, all right, there's a threshold where you need a certain amount of sunlight to actually produce enough vitamin D or all these other things. So there's a ton of other peptides that are produced with that pro-opiomelanocortin, but that's another aspect of the UVB as well. Now, UVA is really, really interesting because UVA has been shown by Professor Richard Weller, who's actually a dermatologist. He's a medical doctor, but also a researcher. And he has shown that both observationally, in mouse models, as well as human clinical trials, that when we shine UVA light onto people, we actually see an increase in nitric oxide within the blood vessel. So nitric oxide is a super small molecule, just a nitrogen and an oxygen bound together. And it has great cardiovascular effects. So we have stores of nitric oxide within our skin. When UVA light hits the skin, it mobilizes those stores of nitric oxide, allowing those nitric oxide molecules to go into our bloodstream. It vasodilates the blood vessels, meaning it opens the blood vessels up, allowing more blood flow to flow through the blood vessels. Which then decreases blood pressure. And he's shown this by shining the UVA light, we can decrease blood pressure. And then when we look at large observational studies tracking how much UVA light people actually get and how much sunlight people get, we see time and time again that the people who get the most amount of sunlight have the largest reductions in cardiovascular incidence and cardiovascular mortality. And one of the reasons for that is probably this increase in nitric oxide, increasing blood flow, decreasing blood pressure, improving cardiovascular outputs. So those are sort of like some of the benefits of UVA and UVB. And then when we look at it from like this dermatology point of view, because I think this is probably a question people are asking, like, all right, well, UV light is supposed to like cause so much damage, right? When we look at it from the dermatology literature, so all the dermatology literature is looking at isolated UVA and UVB light. And again, when we isolate UVA light, that's not what we're getting from sunlight. So isolated UV light is not the same thing as sunlight. That said, when we isolate UVA and UVB light, and let's say we shine it on a little petri dish of cells, so another problem with that is these cells are disconnected from the human body, so they don't also have all these other mechanisms in play to combat the stress of the UV light. But when we isolate UV light on cells, we see that DNA gets broken, more DNA damage accumulates, and then that's when we have cell division, and that's what can lead to cancer. Now, even just thinking about it from that very, again, reductionistic point of view, our body also has DNA repair mechanisms. So outside of sun exposure and outside of any light exposure, our body all throughout the day is constantly breaking DNA. Like DNA is being broken all throughout the day. Toxins we breathe, pollutants we breathe in, chemicals we're being exposed to all throughout the day. Even exercise, like exercise in and of itself is also damaging our DNA. And so throughout the day, our DNA is being damaged. Now we also have DNA repair mechanisms. And what's really interesting here is that the primary governor of DNA repair mechanisms is our circadian rhythm. So our circadian rhythm actually governs when DNA repair mechanisms are being produced and when they're not. And so what we really want is to have a super aligned circadian system and a healthy circadian rhythm to have healthy mechanisms to offset those DNA damage. So our DNA repair mechanisms will offset any DNA damage that occurs. Now, if the DNA repair mechanisms aren't working properly, well, then that's when DNA damage is going to ensue, accumulate, and then that's when we can see these potential increases in risk of cancers. Now, I'll take it from looking at the dermatology literature from an observational standpoint. We see that these large observational studies, it's correlation, so it doesn't equal causation, but it's still helpful to look at this. And so when we look at large observational studies, people who get the most amount of sun exposure we do see an increased rate of basal cell and squamous cell carcinomas. So these are these skin cancers that no one really is like dying from, right? I mean, there may be a couple deaths, especially if it doesn't get treated, but these aren't really deadly skin cancers. The deadly skin cancer is melanoma. So melanoma has a pretty much 100% mortality rate if you don't get it removed. So that's the skin cancer that we want to prevent at all costs. But looking at basal cell and squamous cell, people who get more sun exposure are at increased risk of those skin cancers. When we look at melanoma, it's a different story. So as we increase what we call chronic sun exposure, meaning regular sun exposure all throughout the day, there's two types of sun exposure in the dermatology literature. There's chronic sun exposure, and then there's intermittent sun exposure. Intermittent sun exposure is basically like, all right, you're indoors all day, and then on the weekend you go to the beach and you fry yourself to death, right? That's like intermittent sun exposure. But when we look at chronic sun exposure, regular sun exposure every single day, repeatedly, what we see is that people who have higher chronic sun exposure, people who get more chronic sun exposure, have a reduction in melanoma mortality. So there's not a single study out there, not a single one. And I keep asking people to show me one, especially the people in the dermatology field, to show me one. But there is not one that I know of, at least, showing that as you increase chronic sun exposure, you increase melanoma mortality. It's always the opposite. Increase chronic sun exposure, decrease melanoma mortality. So there's actually a protective effect of sun exposure, chronic sun exposure, to melanoma mortality. Now, this isn't to say to burn, right? When we look at intermittent sun exposure, so burning sun exposure, as we increase the rates of burning, that is when we actually increase melanoma rates and mortality. So it's really the safe sun exposure that we want. And again, looking at that observational studies of more sun exposure, more basal cell and squamous cell carcinomas, that's looking at, and this is my critique about just like science in general, that is looking at a unhealthy population, right? They'll say it's a healthy population because these people don't have like diabetes and cardiovascular disease or anything like that, so they're considered healthy. But we know that the average American is not living a healthy lifestyle, right? So and even thinking about it from a circadian standpoint, all these people in these studies are circadian, their circadian rhythm is misaligned. And so they're not having the proper DNA repair mechanisms, and that's what can lead to these basal cell and squamous cell carcinoma. So again, circadian biology is not taken into account when looking at these large observational studies. So that's sort of the big, eye-opening thing that I saw when I was actually looking at this literature, because most people think, yeah, sun exposure because of the UV light is going to cause skin cancers and things like this. Now, at the same time, we also have to look at this risk-benefit ratio of sun exposures. All right, so maybe there's an increased risk of basal cell and squamous cell carcinomas. There's the risk that we have. But we also know that there's a benefit. All the other effects that I talked about with UV light, there's a benefit. There's a cardiovascular benefit. There's actually a cancer benefit. Vitamin D in and of itself is an anti-cancer molecule. We have these pathways laid out where vitamin D can actually prevent cancer from formulating. So when we look at these large observational studies, we see people get more sun exposure are actually at a decreased risk of non-skin cancers, so major cancers that we want to avoid that are absolutely deadly. They're at a decreased risk of people who get more sun exposure at a decreased risk of cardiovascular mortality, and they're at a decreased risk of all-cause mortality. So that's death from any single cause. So Richard Weller, going back to some of his work, he has a preprint that is out right now. So a preprint is, these researchers can publish a paper that they wrote onto a preprint server. So it's not published, it's not peer reviewed or anything like that, but it's in the peer review process, but it's on the preprint server just so the public can actually have access to it at the moment. And what he showed is that he was looking at this at the UK Biobank large observational study with 400,000 participants, looking at their health outcomes and correlating that with sun exposure. And he saw that it was associated that the people who got the most amount of sun exposure decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, non-skin cancers, and all-cause mortality. What he also saw is that there was an increased risk of basal cell and squamous cell carcinoma. So he did a risk-benefit analysis. So he did what's called a counterfactual analysis. So this, big statistical analysis where what he did was basically asking the question, all right, he had these three groups of people with the low sun exposure, medium sun exposure, and high sun exposure individuals, and, categorize them into those three groups. And he basically asked the question, all right, what if the people with the most amount of sun exposure and the medium amount of sun exposure, what if we put them in the low sun exposure category? What would the outcomes be that we would see from these participants? And what he saw is, he had all the big numbers in, but when he put the numbers into a small little ratio, if you took everyone in the high and medium UV category, the people getting the most amount of sun exposure, and put them in the low sun exposure category, you would have saved one life from skin cancer death because you would be reducing sun exposure. So you'd save one life from skin cancer death, but you would increase and you would actually cause 75 deaths from other causes like cardiovascular disease and non-skin cancer. So clearly there was a 1 to 75 ratio there where there was clearly a greater benefit than there was a risk from that sun exposure. So I think that's something else, these dermatologists need to consider, because as medical doctors, they take the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. So if you're going to try to not do any harm, well, then you need to give the recommendation that's going to do the least amount of harm. And to do the least amount of harm and to actually give the greatest benefit, well, we actually want patients to go get reasonable, smart, conscious, safe sun exposure. This isn't, advocating people to go lay outdoors or in direct sunlight all day. Seek shade when you need to, but also get unprotected, full spectrum sun exposure as well. And there's so many benefits to that. So that's sort of, the situation there with that idea of sun being this big, bad, scary ball in the sky, which it is definitely not.
Yeah, and I think there's also that's actually so interesting because I haven't heard a lot of I've obviously heard some of that information, but a lot of that is new information to me too. But what do you think too about sunscreen and how like chemical sunscreens and the UV filters in sunscreen, how that's also affecting skin cancer and just how the sun affects your skin?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of controversy around this. I never wore sunscreen growing up. I do utilize sunscreen when needed. So I think sunscreen can be utilized in specific scenarios. And when you are utilizing sunscreen, like you said, I would stay away from any chemical-based sunscreens because we know these chemicals can easily be absorbed into the skin. Our skin is very absorbent. And so it's going to be absorbing into the skin, going into our bloodstream. And, there's some correlational data showing that, it increases your risk of skin cancers, things like that. There's some problems with some of those studies. But needless to say, like, we do not want these chemicals in our skin. And some of these chemicals we do know are carcinogenic. A lot of them are not, but a lot of them are also like endocrine disruptors and have other effects. So there are detrimental aspects to some of these chemicals. And when you put them on your skin, they're being absorbed into the skin, going into the bloodstream. We know that for a fact. We have blood tests showing this, that, after wearing sunscreen, we see these chemicals end up in the blood. And that we don't want. So if people are using sunscreen, I would advocate for a mineral-based sunscreen that uses, zinc oxide. So zinc, it goes on top of the skin. It doesn't get absorbed into the skin. The molecule's too big to actually go into your pores of the skin and get into your bloodstream. And even if it does, zinc is not even bad. I mean, people take zinc supplements as well. So the sunscreen I use, which I've had the same small little bottle from my local farmer's market for the past 3 years, and it's not even halfway done. So that tells you how much I don't really use sunscreen. But I've tasted the sunscreen before, because all it is beef tallow, zinc oxide, and some essential oil. So I say, if you can eat your sunscreen, that, I see no problem putting that on your skin. No, not telling people to go eat their sunscreen. But I think also, just being cognizant of the ingredients in the sunscreen, as minimal ingredients as possible, is always going to be the best. Now that said, the best, for lack of better terms, like protection from the sun is to utilize shade and utilize clothing and like hats and things like that. That's always gonna be the best protection. Now, if you are in a scenario where maybe you're at the beach and you don't have shade or something like that, and you have to put some sunscreen on, and you're there you're in the sun for longer than what your body can handle, and that, then I think putting on some sunscreen can be a protective tool there. So I see no problem with some sunscreen here and there. I just think don't want to lather it on every single day, especially because we also do want some unprotected sun exposure for sure. And we know like blocking those UV wavelengths via sunscreen is going to limit vitamin D production and all the other downstream effects of the UV light. But that said, you also want to be cognizant of, you don't want to burn. So if you're in a scenario where you're going to burn, sunscreen can definitely be useful, and then use, mineral-based sunscreen.
Yeah, I also think like especially living in a state like Michigan or these states where the winter is a lot longer, it is a little bit difficult because when even over spring break, the first sun I got very sunburnt
Yeah.
and I just didn't put on any sunscreen, which was not the smartest decision.
Yeah.
But especially like when your body is just not used to it and it's like your first sun, that can also be when you get the most sunburn.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
another thing that I've seen too in recently that's so interesting is sunglasses and how that can affect your skin from getting sunburnt. So
Mhm.
do you know anything about that, or
Yeah.
what's your
Yeah.
thoughts
So I
about
mean,
sunglasses?
this message has definitely been shared about a ton on social media. I've seen it too. So I made a video on this, a whiteboard video, where I distilled all the science that we have. So with all, I'll first talk about like the literature and the research that we have around this. So we only have rat studies. So all these studies are done in rats. So we have no human studies looking at sunglasses and its effect on like the tanning response or sunburning. But we do know that when we shine UV light on the eyes of rats, where we can cover the entire body with tinfoil and just have the eyes exposed, we shine UV light onto the eyes. We do actually see the tanning response occurs. So there is a mechanism at play where the UV light hitting the eyes can actually produce POMC, that big pro hormone, produce alpha MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, producing more melanin within the skin. And so there's actually full body tanning response in the rats just from UV exposure to the eyes, not the skin at all. So they are tanning without the skin exposed, just the eyes exposed. So that said, if let's say the eyes are blocked, which they actually did the same thing. So they blocked the eyes with tinfoil. They had the body exposed to the sun. The body still produced the melanin and still had the tanning response. But what was interesting is it wasn't as great of a tanning response as when they just shined it on the eyes. So we can sort of conclude to that is, all right, if for these rats, if we shine the UV on their eyes and the skin, that's going to have the optimal amount of tanning response, the optimal amount of protection, the least amount of potential for burning. Now, there's a couple studies there, and so we definitely know that for a fact in rats. Now, in terms of, talking about that with humans, well, we know a lot of the mechanisms there and the physiology of the eye and everything, and the tanning response is all the same in humans. So it can be easily concluded that, all right, yeah, maybe it's also happening in humans. That said, I look at, well, a few things. Okay, first, looking at it from, more of a natural approach, right? We would have, our ancestors would have always been exposed to the same light that is hitting their eyes as it is hitting their skin. They would have never had, like something blocking their skin. Although like very northern latitudes where it's very snowy and a lot of glare and things like that, like the Inuits, they actually were like the first people who produced sunglasses, and all it was like, I think they probably used some animal bone or whatever it is, and they carved little slits out of there, so they were still getting full spectrum light, but it was much reduced, and so the glare wasn't there and all that. So there's some benefits with if you're in a very glary environment. But in our natural state, which was in a tons of greenery and trees and all of that, we would have always had the same UV light and sunlight hitting the eyes as it is hitting the skin. So I think whenever we disconnect from what the natural state is that God designed our bodies to be around and our body is expecting, well, then there's going to be some sort of consequence, right? And some sort of different effect that's going on. So that's sort of my idea there. That said, I look at like old Italian guys who are like sunbathing on the beach 24/7, and like they're wearing sunglasses blocking those wavelengths of light, and they're still getting a tan and they're not burning. And so I don't think wearing sunglasses are the end of the world. I That said, like I don't really wear sunglasses. I would encourage people to limit the amount of sunglasses they're using, and how much they're using it, and still getting that. Wearing a hat, that's the best sort of thing there to use. If you're in a super glary environment, tons of snow, skiing on a boat, midday, with tons of water, things like that, and it's very glary, sunglasses can totally be fine to wear and protect yourself from that. But yeah, I think the sunglass story isn't as big of a deal as people probably make it out to be, in terms of like how detrimental they can be. That said, from a circadian standpoint, especially morning sunlight, I think this is the big thing. Morning sunlight, nobody should be wearing sunglasses in the morning. Like we want that bright light, we want that blue light from the sun going into our eyes, which you're blocking when you're wearing sunglasses. So definitely in the morning, you don't want that. And you also want that brightness of light throughout the day. So, just again, being cognizant of not using the sunglasses so much. If people use it here and there, I don't think it's a big deal. I don't use sunglasses, but those are my thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting though, because yeah, I've obviously like there's lots of science behind it too, showing that like yes, whatever. There's some I feel like it's kind of controversial on both sides.
Yeah.
But like when I wore sunglasses last year, because I played tennis and I was always outside, I would get much more sunburnt when I would wear sunglasses versus when I didn't. Now there's also room to talk like there was less sun exposure during the winter time, so maybe there was some like interchangeability there, and then I don't know, I guess now this year I have no idea.
Yeah,
But
I mean, there's a lot of anecdotes. I mean, I can't ignore the anecdotes. Like you'll see it every single time when someone posts about this. All throughout the comments is like, oh yeah, I stopped wearing sunglasses and I stopped burning. So all of those anecdotes, like I'm super aware of those, and I think we should take those as truth. I mean, I'm not gonna like discredit somebody saying that they stopped wearing sunglasses and they stopped burning. Like it's probably true. It probably is.
yeah.
So yeah, I think if people want to not wear sunglasses, and I think they'll probably see that, yeah, they probably do burn less. But again, it's like you look at the old Italian guys wearing sunglasses, and they
Right.
don't seem to be burning. So I don't know. It's definitely probably, and it also could be like a very individualistic sort of a thing where like
For
some
sure.
people maybe are better at creating a tan without with just skin exposed, where they can wear the sunglasses. And so every single person's body is also going to be very different. So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely an interesting conversation.
Is there a relationship between diet and getting more sunburnt, particularly eating ultra processed foods?
Yeah, so I think so. From my read of the literature, we have some like rat studies looking at feeding rats seed oils, increasing their risk of burning, and obviously a lot of ultra processed food have a ton of seed oils. We actually have some interesting, which I haven't heard anybody talk about this, but we have some human studies where we can supplement omega 3s. So with seed oils, like one of the problems is they're very high in omega 6 versus omega 3s. And so we can actually feed people omega 3s, and we see that they have a better tolerance to UV light. They do not burn as much when we feed them more omega 3s. So that's increasing that omega 3, omega 6 balance within the body. That's not to say like the omega 6 itself is what is the harming factor, but what we see from those studies is just increasing omega 3 can can give your body more resilience to those UV wavelengths, so you burn less. And that's for sure. We have a few great human studies on that. They were done a while ago, but still human studies showing that. So there's that aspect, right? When we're eating ultra processed food or eating seed oils, we're not getting enough omega 3s. So definitely the fats that we are consuming are very important, because we know these fats, these lipids, are being stored in our membranes of our cells. And so if our membranes do not contain very high quality lipids per se, then that can have detrimental effects of when sunlight interacts with those lipid membranes of our cells. So I think for sure, like, eating more whole foods, less processed foods, less seed oils, I think as well could be a big thing here. And again, we also know that there are definitely some compounds, a lot of like different plant compounds, that when we ingest those, they actually can have a protective effect internally in our system on sun exposure. So there's even like supplement, or there's like powders out there now, where people drink, and it's like basically like an internal sunscreen where you're getting these different compounds, probably a lot of antioxidants, things like this, that can help protect against higher intensity sun exposure. So I think there's definitely there's for sure a component there, clean. But I think where it comes down to is like eat more whole foods, and you're going to be more resilient to everything, right? Not just sun exposure, but sun exposure as well.
Yeah, for sure. Um, this is kind of a little bit off topic, but what are your thoughts about red light panels? And I guess people, especially someone that like me or who lives in a more northern state that has a longer winter, do you think they're beneficial? Like what are your thoughts about them?
Yeah. So, okay, I'll say a few things. I think, okay, I have concerns on most of the red light panels. The reason for this, and this is not backed by any hard like research that we have. This is purely just a precautionary thing that I think, and it's not really, this isn't really my idea. So one of the leading researchers on how red light affects our mitochondria, his name is Dr. Glenn Jeffrey. I interviewed him for my podcast. He's out of University College London, and he has concerns over the intensity of the light that is coming from these red light therapy panels. So most of these red light therapy panels are super, super high intensity. We measure intensity in milliwatts per centimeter squared. And when we look at, I'll first, take you through what we get from sun. So when we look at sunlight, which is full spectrum from UV all the way to far, far infrared, the intensity of that light is around 100, a little bit over 100 milliwatts per centimeter square. But that's taking all the wavelengths of light. If you take one specific wavelength of light from sunlight, let's say 850 nanometers, which is in the near infrared, which a lot of these red light therapy panels utilize. And they utilize, red, and they utilize a couple of different wavelengths. But if you take one wavelength from the sun, 850 nanometers, that intensity of that specific wavelength is around 1 milliwatt per centimeter square. So super low intensity. Glenn Jeffrey, when he first started doing this research, he was using, I would say like probably medium intensity wavelengths. So it was around like 40 to 60 milliwatts per centimeter squared. He kept going down and down and down intensity. So he went all the way down to 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared and saw the same beneficial aspect of getting those wavelengths of light with very low intensity light. And again, that's what our body's designed to get and receive. It's low intensity light throughout long bouts of time, right? All day long, getting low intensity of these red and infrared wavelengths. Now, his concern with the higher intensity wavelengths, again, we don't have, and we also have we have studies showing that high intensity devices have health benefits. So that's, there's no, arguing that. We have studies showing that. But there, with just like any drug, right? There could be benefits, but there are also going to be risks. So his concern is that this high intensity, essentially, again, this is more of a hypothesis, but essentially what's happening is that you're pushing tons of photons, tons of red and infrared photons in the body, essentially clogging up the electron transport chain, which is in your mitochondria, which is where electrons funnel through, clogging up that electron transport chain, not allowing electrons' energy to flow properly. And then you can have detrimental aspects within the mitochondria. So that's the idea there with these high intensity devices. Now that said, I know a lot of people, pay a lot of money for these high intensity devices. So the best thing, yeah, they're expensive. Yeah. And so the best thing is like, and again, this is from a precautionary principle, is that my thing is like your best friend is distance. So distance is your best friend. The further you are from the device, the lower the intensity is naturally, just how the physics works of how the light interacts with the body. So the further you are, the better. And even with these panels, that especially when they have infrared light, even if you just turn it on, and let's say you're working indoors all day, you turn it on, you keep it on all day, and you just bounce it against a wall. So you just turn it around, not facing you directly, but bouncing it against the wall. Infrared wavelengths specifically have a very, very big scatter reflex. So they will hit a wall and scatter right back at you. So bounce off the wall, come right back at you, where you don't even need the direct contact. And that is, again, is reducing that intensity. So that's like my recommendation for most red light therapy devices. There are some on the market that directly advertise low intensity devices. So there's this one company, I don't have any like affiliation with them, but there's one company called Gemba Red. They have low intensity red light therapy, LED red light therapy devices. So that's like what I recommend to people. What I'm sitting in front of right now is a Sauna Space 250 watt red incandescent light bulb. So it's basically, it's a big red incandescent light bulb, emits tons of heat as well. That's all that infrared coming to you. It's much lower intensity, and it's lower intensity, and it's also full spectrum. So again, with these red light therapy devices, they're also narrow band wavelengths. So there are only specific wavelengths, maybe 670 red, 850 near infrared, maybe a couple other wavelengths. Whereas with the incandescent light bulb, especially like this one that I have, it's full spectrum red and infrared. So you're getting broadband, much more similar to the sunlight than these panels. So I don't think they're the end of the world. I just think people need to be a little bit precautious. Like, don't sit in front of these high intensity panels all day long. That definitely should not, like, people shouldn't be doing. And even like they advertise only a couple minutes or 3,
Yeah.
5, whatever. So they don't even advertise that long, and they know because there could potentially be side effects of especially going too long. So I think that's the big thing. I don't think people need to worry too much about it, but I think they can be utilized smartly. But really, the best source of red and infrared light is the sun. And we also don't need to be in direct sunlight to get it. So in shade, especially green shade, so greenery, chlorophyll, which is what makes plants green, it reflects red and infrared light. So it absorbs the UV and the blue. So proportionally, you have less UV, less blue, but you have tons and tons of red and infrared. So sitting under a shade is the best, source of red and infrared light, much better than any device will ever give you. The sun's always going to be the best source of light. But I understand people who live northern latitudes, they could definitely be utilized. When I'm up in North Carolina, I utilize my sauna space every single day during the winter. It's like the best thing. I love it. So I
Mhm.
think it could definitely be utilized for sure, especially different scenarios like that.
Yeah. And okay, I know we kind of touched on this too, a little bit about the mitochondria, and we did talk about it, and I know you just mentioned it not that long ago, but I kind of want to dive deeper into the importance of light on the mitochondria and just the mechanisms behind that, and like how the light interacts with cellular energy production.
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is more and more getting like elucidated, and our understanding of this is getting better and better as we continue. I mean, this research has been going on since the 1990s by a researcher named Tina Carew. She was a Russian researcher who basically figured out that red light gets absorbed by a specific protein within the electron transport chain of the mitochondria called cytochrome C oxidase that basically allows more protons to be pumped up across the membrane. So now you have this charge gradient, essentially charging your mitochondria like batteries. That's basically what your mitochondria are. They're these little batteries where there's a higher positive charge on the outside of the mitochondria in the inner mitochondrial space, and there's a negative charge in the matrix of the mitochondria, creating the charge gradient. That's with the red light. There's also some theories about how red and infrared light can be absorbed by nanowater around ATP synthase, which is the last protein complex of the electron transport chain. This is basically a very small nano motor, and it's quite literally a motor. At the end of it, it's this rotor that spins super fast. With each spin, you can produce an ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is typically thought as the energy currency of the cell. And with around that rotor is water. And the idea is that the water can be very viscous, but when the water absorbs infrared light, red and infrared light, it reduces the viscosity of the water. The rotor can spin much faster, more ATP can be produced. And that's what we see when we shine red and infrared light on mitochondria, we see more ATP being produced. And then there's one other mechanism that is being talked about at the moment, where there's some great researchers that are going to be publishing this paper very soon, within the end of the year, where essentially when electrons funnel through the electron transport chain, when they go from one protein complex to the other, there's an energy barrier. So as electrons go through, they lose energy. So they're in a less like energy state. When they funnel through, to get to one protein complex to the other, they actually require a little like boost of energy to jump from one protein complex to the other. So that energy flow requires a little energy input. And that exact amount of energy input that it needs is almost the exact amount of energy that a near infrared photon provides. So it's perfect that the near infrared photon, when it penetrates completely through the body, interacts with the mitochondria, it actually allows the electrons to directly funnel through the electron transport chain faster, more electron flow, more of a charge gradient, increasing the charge of the mitochondria. And then again, all those downstream consequences of having healthier mitochondria. And again, that is the state that our mitochondria expects. It is our mitochondria expects to be surrounded by near infrared light 24/7. So those are some of the mechanisms at play here. And when we see it more so from like, all right, what are the outcomes we see? It's like everything: reduction in blood glucose, improve recovery, improve wound healing, improved cardiovascular effects. Even infrared light can also mobilize nitric oxide as well, just like UV light can. So there's a broad array of things. But again, it's affecting the mitochondria, which is the foundation of all health. So we're going to see, and as we can continue to research this, we're going to see effects all throughout the body. And it's not going to be, maybe one benefit. It's going to be a ton and tons of benefits. And it's all around this cohesive sort of benefit that we're getting from the red and infrared light. So that's a couple of the mechanisms there.
Yeah, and like you said too earlier about how the mitochondria is just so essential to every bodily process and just ATP. And I know Dr. Casey Means and Dr. Callie Means have a good book about this. But just everything revolves around the mitochondria. And when that's not working properly, that's when you get chronic disease and just all these things that are becoming more prevalent, especially in America, just from our diets and lifestyles, the way that we're just sedentary and
Hmm.
we are eating super crappy food and just
Yep.
all the things. And like you said, a lack of sunlight. And it's pretty interesting actually. And I feel like a lot of people just they think, oh my gosh, well our body's just gonna do it on its own. But it's like when you're not providing your body the proper nutrients and the proper things that it needs to run, it's not gonna run. So
Exactly right. Yep. 100%.
another question that I have too is about blue light blocking glasses and like which ones are scams, which ones are true. Maybe they're all true. I don't know.
Yeah, so I would say the clear blue light blocking glasses do not work at all. So clear lenses that you get like on Amazon, or even I know even like ophthalmologists will actually prescribe clear lens blue light blocking glasses, and they're like super expensive as an add-on. Uh,
Hmm.
so those they block blue light. Blue light again is a spectrum, so it's from 400 nanometers to around 500 nanometers, give or take. They block blue light from 400 nanometers to 420 nanometers. The blue light that you get from a screen or an LED or anything like that is from 420 nanometers to 500 nanometers. So it blocks zero of the blue light that is even in the indoor environment. So there's no point. I mean, maybe the placebo effect can be a little beneficial there if people think it's blocking blue light, but outside of that, it's not actually blocking blue light. So the clear ones are, I think, a complete scam. Um, Amber tinted blue light blocking glasses for sure work. We have literature showing this, and they improve sleep, recovery, and all those other things. So at night, once the sun sets, after sunset, if you're exposed to artificial light at night, I highly recommend it for everybody to wear, amber tinted. Again, make sure they're those red amber color to the lens, and you're going to have tons of benefits there. Blocking the blue light, not allowing your body to naturally produce melatonin. The circadian system is not going to be delayed. It's not going to be affected very much at all there. So that's a big thing. But at the end of the day, it's like try for nighttime. Try to just limit as much light exposure as possible. Like the ideal scenario is like you don't use them at all and just have an environment that is suitable for a dim environment, not blue light. So using circadian friendly light bulbs and things like that, and dimming the lights at night. That's the ideal scenario. But if you're exposed to tons of bright light at night and blue light at night, yeah, they can definitely be beneficial.
Is there a specific brand that you like or you use of the glasses, or are all the ones I guess that have the red lens on Amazon or wherever, are they good, or what's your thoughts
Yeah,
on that?
they're all going to be a little different. So I wear Raw Optics. They're sort of like the pioneers in the space, I believe, and they're definitely the best ones that I've ever found. They work with Dr. Alexander Wunsch, who's one of the leading photobiology experts, who's alongside like Jack Cruz and a couple other people who have really pioneered this space. So they work directly with him. So I find a lot of comfort with knowing that like what they are actually giving is actually going to do the job. You can use a handheld spectrometer and actually test some of these, and I've done this in the past. You have ones that the lens look the same color, but they actually don't block the same wavelengths of light. Any amber tinted blue light blocking glasses are gonna be better than nothing without a doubt. I use the Raw Optics ones, but I think anyone can get any ones that are amber tinted are going to be beneficial.
And I guess what are some realistic changes that someone could make about their lighting and even just screen exposure, which obviously pretty simple, don't be exposed to screens, but what are some more simple ways? And obviously even wearing the glasses, but if you have more tips, what are your tips?
Yeah, I mean, I think even on like the phones or laptops or an iPad or anything like that, in like settings, people can go into settings and put on the color filters to make it red. That's what I have.
Yeah.
So after sunsets, my phone turns red. One, it makes me not even want to be on my phone because I don't like looking at it.
Yeah.
But if I am looking at it, at least I'm not exposed to those shorter wavelengths of blue light. So that's probably the easiest thing people do and like a super free thing. But like I said, circadian friendly light bulbs. I utilize again and my recommendation for people is the ones from Raw Optics. They just came out with a bulb called Lumios, where the idea here is that it has tons of near infrared. So every single circadian friendly light bulb out there that it doesn't have blue light at night, but it also lacks all the infrared, which we also would be exposed to 24/7 at night because moonlight also reflects infrared light from the sun. So at night we would also be exposed to infrared 24/7. So that's, I think, an important factor when looking at light bulbs is using, ones that also have infrared. So I use Lumios. They're amazing, super nice on the eye. And then, like amber incandescents, people can use things like that for around the house or, a dorm or things like that. And yeah, I think those are, some just simple, practical takeaways. For me, I sort of go to the extreme. So when I'm up in college and we have a club meeting late into the night or something, I'll have my blue blockers on. I'll have a hat as well because we also don't want light coming in from the top of the eye going down into the retina, because most of the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, the cells that get stimulated from the blue light, are buried basically at the bottom of the retina. So light coming in from the top is one of the worst things, again, because when light is coming from the top, that's where sunlight's always above us, never below us. So our body knows that light coming from the top is the most stimulating light source. So I wear a hat, blue blockers, and then I also try to cover as much skin as possible as well. Dark clothings, covering as much skin, because our skin also has what's called melanopsin, this pigment that is in those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Melanopsin absorbs blue light and has an effect on the circadian system. So this is not skin exposure to blue light at night is not going to have a effect on the central circadian system, but our skin also has a circadian rhythm within it. So it has a peripheral circadian system, and skin's the largest organ of our body. So that's going to have an effect locally on the skin cells' circadian system, getting exposed to blue light on the skin. So that's going to be a lesser effect. Obviously, the primary circadian stimulus is through the eyes, but if you can also cover as much skin as possible, that's another thing that I try to do as well.
Yeah, I'm in the process of still we're trying to get more of the red light bulbs. We still have not gotten it yet. I'm like every time we turn the lights on and I'm like, "Mom, we gotta get some of these." But yeah, especially I'm gonna invest in one for my dorm, especially just at night when I'm studying or
Mhm.
whatever. I'll just put one in my lamp or something so that less blue light exposure. Another thing that I have too on my phone, and maybe I don't know if it's fully works, but it's like a blue light blocking screen protector.
Screen,
And
yeah.
when I turn it over, I can see like the red around it to the point where
Mhm.
like I can see it's like blocking something at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I guess you maybe touched on this a little bit, but if you have like tips for someone that's going into college and maybe can't control everything, but what are the probably some like top things that you think that are necessary and essential for them to be able to do?
Yeah. So biggest thing is whenever you have a break, just try to be outside as much as possible. I know studying outside is not the easiest thing, and sometimes I'll have to go inside to lock in.
Hmm.
But as much as you can get outside is the best, because even being outdoors throughout the day is also going to offset some of the negative effects of artificial light at night. So even being outdoors in the middle of the day, you're going to have that benefit for nighttime as well. And then it's like simple things like I said, with the blocking the blue light. I think those are some big things there that people can do. And yeah, having sort of a dorm that is suitable for that, especially at night. Hopefully your roommate doesn't think you're crazy with the red lights. But if you can convince your roommate and that's all good, then trying to have that circadian friendly lighting in your dorm is also probably the one of the best things, because especially before going to bed. So those are some of the things. And then yeah, getting morning sunlight is so beneficial. If you have early classes, wake up a little bit earlier and just get out there as early as possible. And yeah, I think that's the big thing. It's like being outdoors as much as you possibly can. Again, I know people aren't going to be able to be outdoors all the time. I'm not. And so I think just being cognizant of the little steps taken, being outside as much as possible is always going to be best.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm kind of interested, what does your morning and nighttime routine kind of look like? What time do you normally go to bed? What time do you normally wake up? Just, I guess, and it can be different for everybody just based on where they live and how much the sun is out. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, during the summer here, I'll go to bed at 9:30 and then wake up before sunrise. So right now, sun is rising at 6:50. I wake up at 6:30, 6:40. I have a super blessed to be like 5 minutes drive from the beach. So go to the beach, watch the sunrise,
Awesome.
which is amazing. At my school, I'm more near Charlotte, so much more inland, so I don't have the beach. But I just go up to our bleachers, so I wake up for sunrise as many days as possible. If I have a late night, which for me is like I make the commitment of yes, school is my number one priority. Like I'm focusing very much on school, but if I don't have my work done, which the reason I make this commitment is to get my work done as soon as possible. But if once it's like 11 o'clock, I am like and hopefully it never gets to that point. Sometimes it does, but if it does, it's like 11 o'clock. I'm done. I'm not even like if I miss the assignment, I miss the assignment. I'll talk to my teacher about it. But that's sort of the thing that I've made the like commitment to is like I'm not staying past 11 o'clock. And there's been nights. My freshman year, I did not have this commitment. My freshman year, there was nights where I was up till it was 2 nights. I remember distinctly. I was up till like 3 a.m. working on this essay, and that was not very very great. But the next morning, I got as much sun as possible. So you try to mitigate those things. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
waking up early for sunrise pretty much every single day. Go up to the bleacher, see it as high up from the horizon as possible. And yeah, nighttime routine, same thing. It's like my blue block, I'm very religious about, putting those blue blockers on as much like every single night. And people think I'm crazy, but I don't care what people think.
Exactly.
And yeah, so that's a little bit about what I do.
I know. I used to be pretty good about going to bed early, and it's just been, I think, a little bit more difficult in the summertime, just especially right before I'm about to leave, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, and then all of a sudden it's like 11 o'clock, 11:30. I'm like, oh my gosh, I
Yeah.
gotta go to bed. And so, kind of wrapping up just a little bit, but if you could give someone listening just one simple takeaway, if they could only do one thing, what would you tell them to do to change?
Yeah. I would say
There's a lot of things, so if you
yeah,
can't
there's a
choose
lot of
one,
things.
it's
No, no. I
fine.
mean, I would say it's so simple, and it's like sort of like cliche how simple it is, but it's
No,
like
yeah,
just get outside, right? It
yeah,
is really that simple. Again, don't need to be in direct sunlight all the time. Be in shade, but as much as we can get outside as humanly possible is the best thing. Lunch breaks, go outside. Even in like the freezing winter, I know some people if you're super up north, maybe it can be even colder, but I'm out there in my big jacket, and that's a big thing. That's a great thing. Infrared light can penetrate through clothing, so even you can be fully bundled up, you're still getting all the benefits of that infrared light and the brightness of the light and so many other things. So yeah, the big thing is like super simple: get outside as much as possible, and yeah, and do your things that you would normally do. Just bring them outdoors. So even in the morning, like if you drink morning cup of coffee, drink it outdoors. If you scroll on your phone in the morning, scroll on your phone outdoors. So whatever it may be, like try to just habit stack and bring it outside.
yeah. And then, like, one of our last questions is what are some books, researchers, or resources that you religiously go to or that you would recommend for people that want to learn more? What are your favorites that we should
Yeah.
know?
So in terms of sunlight, there was a brand new book that just came out a couple weeks ago called In Defense of Sunlight by Rowan Jacobson. This is like my own. I've been wanting to have like a book recommendation for people about sunlight, and there hasn't really been one that really understands the full picture. He did an amazing job. I sat down with him to have a conversation about it. And yeah, that book is probably my number one recommendation for people, especially people just getting into like this whole sunlight story. Very eye opening, tells the full picture. So that would be my big recommendation. Some people like some research. I mean, Glenn Jeffrey's phenomenal. He's been on Huberman's podcast. People can listen to that one. That's a big recommendation of mine to listen to that. Dr. Roger Schwelt has been also on Huberman. His podcast with Huberman was great. So those are big. Those are two big podcasts I think people can listen to that are super valuable. Again, all about sunlight and the effects of just light in general on our body. So yeah, I think those are some great resources for people.
Nice. And so, where can everyone find you, follow you? What's your Instagram, all that stuff?
Yeah, so my Instagram is just my first and last name, Jonathan Jarecki. Same thing on X, first and last name. Um, I'm on TikTok also, but I don't really post. And then my YouTube, which is also my podcast, is called The Signal with Jonathan Jarecki. That's on all major streaming platforms, Apple, Spotify, things like that. And then also Substack as well. Again, first and last name, people can find me there. But yeah, Substack, I do more some in-depth science articles that I write, and that's been super fun getting into a lot of the nuance and all that, which has been great. But yeah, those are the platforms.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's been such an honor.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. This was a great conversation.